What strange jobs did children have in Victorian times? Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back into the fog and smoke of Victorian Britain. So, get comfortable, settle in, let the noise of the day fade out, and let's wander, slowly, into a world that was equal parts fascinating, appalling, and, if we're honest, mildly absurd. The Victorians, as you may know, were very proud of themselves. They liked to think they had perfected civilization. They built railways, invented photography, and gave us 1,000 decorative teapots. But beneath the polite drawing rooms and the starched collars, there was another side, a darker one, a grubbier one, and, unfortunately, one that involved putting children to work in ways that make you wonder if the adults were even trying. You see, the Industrial Revolution was wonderful for machines, less wonderful for small humans. Factories needed hands, mines needed crawlers, and chimneys, those endless chimneys, needed someone slim enough to wriggle through soot-filled brick tunnels without getting wedged. Naturally, the solution was children. So, tonight we're drifting through the strange, sometimes ridiculous, and often cruel jobs that Victorian children found themselves doing. And we'll do it slowly, because it's late, and because there's no rush. Let's begin with one of the classics, the chimney sweep. It sounds almost charming if you only know it from old musicals. A jaunty boy with a broom singing from rooftop to rooftop. The reality, of course, was more about inhaling soot until your lungs gave up, and occasionally getting stuck halfway up a flue. The job was simple enough in theory. Wealthy households needed their chimneys cleaned, otherwise soot would build up, fires would start, and then the entire street might burn down. So, sweeps employed climbing boys, sometimes climbing girls, though in truth there was very little climbing involved. It was mostly wriggling. Children as young as 6 would be shoved up narrow flues, scraping away at soot with brushes or just with their hands. The job had its hazards, which is the polite Victorian way of saying it was horrendous. Children would often get jammed in tight bends and suffocate. If they panicked, they could slide back down, breaking bones. And if they didn't die from an accident, there was always chimney sweep's cancer, a lovely condition caused by prolonged exposure to soot. It usually showed up on the skin in later years, provided they lived long enough. The sweeps themselves weren't exactly kind employers. Many would light small fires underneath to encourage the children upward, because, naturally, nothing motivates like imminent combustion. If a child came down too slowly, they were beaten, and if they grew too large to fit, they were simply replaced by someone smaller. Still, the Victorians did not see this as unusual. It was just part of life. Children were cheaper than adults and far less likely to unionize, which, of course, made them perfect employees. Let's drift over to another fine occupation, the coal mine. Coal was the bloodline of Victorian Britain. It powered the factories, the trains, and the endless tea kettles, and somebody had to dig it out. Once again, children were the ideal solution. They were sent down into mines as trappers, which was not nearly as adventurous as it sounds. A trapper's job was to sit in the dark all day, in a tunnel barely wider than their shoulders. Their task was to open and close ventilation doors for passing coal carts. That was it. No lantern, no company, just sitting in pitch blackness, waiting for the sound of approaching wheels. Some children started as young as 5. Imagine being left alone for 12 hours in total darkness with nothing but rats and dripping water for entertainment. It was not, let's say, the most enriching childhood. Older children might become hurriers, hauling carts of coal through narrow tunnels. They wore leather belts with chains attached, crawling on hands and knees to drag half-ton loads behind them. Their bodies became warped from the strain, and, naturally, many died in collapses or explosions. The Victorians, for all their pride and progress, were still fairly casual about things like workplace safety. But not all child jobs were quite so grim. Some were simply odd. Take the crossing sweeper. Streets in Victorian London were a chaotic mess of horse manure, mud, and the occasional dead dog. Pedestrians who valued their shoes would pay children to sweep a clean path across the street for them. These children stood at busy crossings with brooms, hoping to earn a penny from a passing gentleman or lady. It wasn't dangerous, unless you counted dodging carriages, but it was humiliating. Crossing sweepers were considered the lowest of the low, just a step above beggars. Still, for some, it was better than starving. And if they were lucky, they might even pick up gossip from the wealthy, which could be sold for extra pennies. Another peculiar role was the bird scarer. This one is exactly what it sounds like. Farmers needed someone to keep birds away from their crops. So they hired children to sit in fields all day, clapping, shouting, or banging pots together to frighten off crows. The job required no particular skill other than having lungs and not being asleep. Still, some children enjoyed it. After all, they got to be outside, and occasionally they could sneak in a nap anyway. But the pay was dreadful, and standing in a wet field from dawn to dusk was hardly healthy. Still, compared to coal mining, it was practically luxurious. Of course, there were the factory jobs. Spinning mills, weaving sheds, match factories, every kind of machine needed small fingers to keep it running. Children were useful because they could crawl under moving machinery to fix jams, which often ended with the loss of those small fingers, or occasionally entire limbs. But that was considered a minor inconvenience. After all, there were plenty of other children waiting to take their place. In match factories, children dipped sticks into phosphorus paste all day. This sometimes caused phossy jaw, a condition where the bones of the jaw literally rotted away. Imagine a workplace hazard so bad that your face disintegrates, and yet somehow people still queued for the job. That was Victorian industry in a nutshell. Then there were jobs so specific, so bizarre that they barely seem real. Take the pure finder. The word pure here is misleading. It referred to dog excrement, which tanners used in leather production. Pure finders were mostly adults, but sometimes children, who scoured the streets collecting dog droppings in buckets. They were paid by the pound. Yes, literally by the pound. One imagines dinner conversation in such households was limited. Or consider the mudlarks. These were children who waded into the filthy banks of the Thames at low tide, searching for anything they could sell, bits of coal, scrap metal, lost trinkets. They spent their days knee-deep in sewage, with dead rats floating by. It wasn't glamorous, but occasionally someone might find a coin or a copper kettle, which was enough to keep the family alive another day. And yet, despite all this, the Victorians often romanticized child labor. They claimed it built character, it taught discipline. They conveniently ignored the stunted growth, the mangled limbs, and the general despair. reformers did eventually pass laws, limiting the hours children could work, setting minimum ages, even banning certain jobs. But it was a slow process, and employers were always creative in finding loopholes. The real irony, of course, is that while working-class children were hauling coal or rotting their jaws in match factories, upper-class Victorian children were being scolded for not holding their teacups properly. The same society that put 5-year-olds in mines also produced etiquette manuals explaining how to avoid the disgrace of sneezing in public. So, as we drift through these strange jobs, we see a world that was both cruel and absurd. A world where children were seen as cheap labor. The most inbred monarchs in European history. Hey everyone, still awake? If you are, let's quietly slide into another story. This one takes us away from the soot of Victorian Britain and into the gilded but rather questionable world of royal dynasties. If there's one thing European royals loved, apart from velvet capes and declaring war over dinner, it was marrying their cousins. The idea was simple: keep the bloodline pure, avoid strangers, make sure all the land, money, and dubious family heirlooms stayed firmly inside the family. The result, of course, was not exactly purity. It was more like genetic soup, a soup that had been reheated one too many times. Let's drift through a few of the more memorable examples. We can begin, naturally, with Charles II of Spain, known affectionately to historians as the Bewitched. Charles was the product of so much Habsburg inbreeding that his family tree looked more like a wreath. By the time he was born in 1661, the dynasty had been marrying close relatives for generations. His father was also his mother's uncle, which, even in 17th century Spain, raised some eyebrows. The results were predictable. Charles was sickly from birth. He could barely walk until he was 8. He struggled to chew food, and speaking was something of an optional hobby. His jaw was so misaligned, the famous Habsburg jaw, that it looked as though he were perpetually chewing an invisible turnip. He suffered from seizures, hallucinations, and a complete inability to rule. But he did manage to live to the age of 38, which is either a miracle or a medical puzzle. Naturally, the dynasty ended with him. He had no children. Not for lack of trying, he married twice, but as one court physician delicately put it, his body was that of a man, but all else was more appropriate to a child, which is a very 17th century way of saying nothing was working properly.
But Charles was hardly alone. Let's drift over to the Austrian branch of the family. The Habsburgs, as a rule, enjoyed marrying cousins so close they barely needed to send wedding invitations. Over time, the family's distinctive jaw became something of a mascot. Painters politely smoothed it over in portraits, but in real life, the effect was impossible to miss. One Habsburg archduke was described as handsome, in a way, if one could ignore the face, which is admittedly difficult. Another was noted for drooling continuously because his jaw simply couldn't close. Court etiquette probably involved a great deal of linen napkins. Of course, it wasn't only the Habsburgs. The Bourbon dynasty of France did their fair share. By the 18th century, French royals were marrying cousins at such a rate that family gatherings looked suspiciously like weddings. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was the product of Bourbon-Habsburg overlap, which explains why his jawline was more notable than his actual politics. His descendants didn't fare much better. Marie Antoinette herself was a Habsburg import. She wasn't especially inbred compared to some, but she carried enough of the family jaw to make caricaturists very happy. And then we have the British royals, who, naturally, were not about to be left out. Queen Victoria, in particular, was something of a one-woman genetic distribution center. She and Prince Albert were first cousins, which, by royal standards, was practically progressive. Together, they had 9 children, who then went on to marry into most of the thrones of Europe. This created what we might call the hemophilia situation. Hemophilia, a blood clotting disorder, began spreading through royal houses thanks to Victoria's descendants. Russian Tsarevich Alexei had it. Spanish princes had it. German royals had it. It was like a grim family heirloom passed down with the tiaras and the questionable sideburns. Of course, the Victorians preferred to call it the royal disease, which is one way of putting a positive spin on your family bleeding uncontrollably from minor cuts. But perhaps one of the more tragic examples comes from the Russian Romanovs. They had already intermarried heavily with German cousins, but when Tsar Nicholas II married Alexandra, herself a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, they ensured hemophilia landed squarely in the Russian line. Their son, Alexei, became the poster child of the condition. He was protected, coddled, and constantly at risk of bleeding to death from something as trivial as bumping his knee. This, in turn, led to the rise of Rasputin. The mad monk convinced Alexandra he could heal the boy, which meant he quickly became the most powerful man in the empire. And from there, well, we know how Russian history went. Spoiler, not great. So you could say that a long chain of cousin marriages helped pave the way for the Russian Revolution, which is quite the historical butterfly effect. The irony in all this is that the royals truly believed in their strategy. To them, keeping bloodlines pure meant preserving divine right. In reality, it just meant producing children who looked perpetually exhausted and sometimes couldn't chew properly. They wanted to strengthen their dynasties, but often weakened them instead. Today, of course, cousin marriage is frowned upon in most societies, though one suspects a few royals might still quietly approve. Tradition, after all, dies hard. So as we drift here among the portraits of pale monarchs with unfortunate jaws and rather limited stamina, let's pause. The royal obsession with inbreeding gave Europe centuries of fragile heirs, disastrous reigns, and the occasional genetic catastrophe. But it also gave us something else. Endless entertainment for historians, who can always rely on the Habsburgs to provide a jaw-dropping anecdote.